Many thanks. You want that? Cool. Yeah, I'm David and Bathsheba this week. I'm not surprised that we're a little low on attendance. It's never really the most exciting lesson when you're talking about David and Bathsheba. And, it's interesting, right? As Methodists, I don't know how many of you grew up in the Methodist Church. I grew up in the Methodist Church. David and I were talking about this yesterday. And throughout my life, and particularly my upbringing, talking about sin was never really at the top of the list for Cradle Methodists. It's not the thing that I've focused on. I have at different points in my life, but just thinking from the big picture, talking and thinking about sin is something I'd just rather not do. It makes me uncomfortable. It does not make me feel good. I don't like doing it. And so I think this is generally the kind of Methodist approach to talking about sin is to not. And there's positives and negatives to that. On the positive side, the gospel story isn't actually about sin. The gospel story is not fundamentally about sin. It's about restoration and renewal. It's about grace. It's about new life. It's about never-ending life. And when we make the gospel about sin, I think we are reducing the gospel to something that it is not. So for a Cradle Methodist to not have focused very much on sin throughout his life, on the one hand, makes sense. On the other hand, we would be foolish to ignore sin's reality in our life. And I think doing so, we do so at our own peril. And so David and Bathsheba, that story offers us, I think, an interesting and engaging way to reflect not just on David's brokenness and fallenness, but a way to reflect on our own and how God responds. So by way of introduction and reminder, the guy that we're talking about today is a guy who is described in Scripture as a man after God's own heart. He was chosen by God to be the king of God's people. He defeated Goliath, formed covenant with Jonathan, established Jerusalem as the capital of Israel from that day to this day, brings the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem, sets in motion the decision to build a temple, and is the same guy who feeds Mephibosheth. It's that guy that we're talking about. And I named today Peak and Valley. I gotta get rid of this little notification here. I named today Peak and Valley because it's so stunning to me that the same guy that we've been talking about is the same guy that we're going to talk about today. And I don't want to lose sight of that. To this point in David's life, everything that we've heard about David on my read is exclusively positive. We have only heard good things about David. In fact, we've only heard so much good about David that we're tempted to view David as floating above the earth, right? As one who doesn't actually walk on the same dirt that you and I do. Today changes that. And this story reminds us that actually he is one of us. In fact, reminds us in one of the most uncomfortable ways that he's one of us. So this is a story that unfolds in 2 Samuel 11 and 12. And on Sunday, we're going to focus a little bit more on 12. So I thought that while it's just us guys, we would focus a little bit more on 11 today. 12 is kind of the comeback trail. 11 is the descent into the abyss. And frankly, it's hard to talk about chapter 11 on a Sunday morning with children in the room. So figured we would focus this morning on chapter 11 a little bit more and see what comes of it. So we're going to start at the very beginning. If you want to follow along, you're welcome to. We've also got some of the words that you can't read up on the screen. So you're welcome for my wonderful formatting, and I won't do that again. So here's 11. In the spring of the year, the time when kings go out to battle, Keep that in mind. In the spring of the year, when the kings go out to battle, why do the kings go out to battle in the spring of the year? Winter's come to an end. The rainy season. Oh, okay. That was just my eyesight going. So in the spring of the year, why do kings go out to battle in the spring of the year? The winter's over. The rainy season is coming to an end. This is the time when it makes sense to go to battle. Chapter 10 is coming off an extended battle with the Ammonites. And so we think at the beginning of the chapter, this is just an extension of what has been going on. And there's no reason or cause for concern. In the spring of the year, the time when kings go out to battle, David sent Joab with his officers and all Israel with him, and they ravaged the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah. But David remained at Jerusalem. In the spring of the year, when kings go to battle, David remained in Jerusalem. When we read this with careful attention, we know from the very first verse in this two-chapter narrative, we know from the very first verse that something is not right. We know that David is not doing what kings do, which means, by the way, that David is not doing what God called him to do. David is not doing what God made him to do. We'll revisit this in your conversations a little bit later, but take note that when we refuse to be who God made us to be, the road ahead gets a lot more dangerous. The temptations ahead become a lot more profound because we are running not toward the men that God made us to be, but we are running away from the men God made us to be. And when you are running away from the man God made you to be, it's much easier for us to find ourselves in the far country, if you will, to find ourselves lost. Verse 2 goes like this. It happened late one afternoon when David rose from his couch and was walking about the roof of the king's house. And he saw from the roof a woman bathing. And the woman was very beautiful. David sent someone to inquire about the woman, and it was reported, this is Bathsheba, daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite. So David sent messengers to get her. Actually says take her. And she came to him, and he lay with her. Now she was purifying herself after her period. Can't talk about that on Sunday morning. Then she returned to her house, and the woman conceived, and she sent and told David, hey, I'm pregnant. There's a lot going on there, gentlemen. An awful lot going on there. David goes up to his roof, common thing to do. You would have space on your roof because you could catch some of the evening breeze. That's not unusual. David is in the palace, probably the high point in the city of David, which isn't all that big, by the way, just a couple few acres. And that's not unusual for David to go to the roof. It's not unusual for the king to have the highest vantage point. It's not unusual for him to be looking around at the lower roofs around him. It's not unusual for him to take note of a pretty lady. It might be unusual for Bathsheba to bathe on the roof, but there's no indication really culturally that that's abnormal. And I'll tell you that interpreters historically, I think, have made the mistake of saying, well, this is all really Bathsheba's fault. I mean, come on, she's naked on the she's not naked, she's naked on the roof. I mean, that's really her fault. But gentlemen, let's be clear. David initiates the action, or choice of words. David is the one who starts this. Bathsheba was cleansing herself ritually after her menstrual cycle had come to an end. This is part of normal course ritual purification. So we know, by the way, that because she's just finished her cycle, that Uriah the Hittite didn't get that lady pregnant. In fact, and nobody got that lady pregnant except David, because she just finished. She's still cleansing herself. So this is not Bathsheba's fault. At the very least, we would say both of them have contributed to this. Let us not as men cast the blame on the woman and say, well, if she hadn't been bathing, none of this would have happened. David's just trying to be a good guy. No, David wasn't trying to be a good guy. David, in the springtime, when kings go to war, stayed home. If David had been who David was supposed to be, he's not even on the roof. So we just want to disabuse ourselves of the notion that, well, this is just, David's trying to be a good dude and Bathsheba screwed it up. So David sends a message. It says that in the Hebrew, I like this a little bit better because it's a little bit more to the point. David takes her from her home and brings her to the palace. The two of them have relations. Again, you can't talk about that on Sunday morning. She gets pregnant, and then she's the one sending a message to David. It all happens in just a few short verses. But what happens in the first 5 verses of chapter 11 changes the trajectory, not just of David's life, changes the trajectory of Israel's future in the end. And so this turns out to be a major deal. So listen to how David deals with this. And I want to think about this through the lens of like I said earlier, through the lens of our own brokenness. Right? Too often, I think we allow ourselves to move from one bad decision into a host of sinful behaviors. Exactly what we see happen in David's story. So maybe your sin or your brokenness is different than David's, but I think we can all agree that all of us have screwed it up at one point or another in our life. And I think you will recognize yourself. You will recognize your own behavior. I'm not suggesting this is going to make us feel good. We will end feeling okay about ourselves. Don't worry. But for a moment, let's recognize ourselves in this story and see that when we fail to be who God made us to be, and when we make not just a bad decision and not just a mistake, but when we sin, it typically will lead us down a path that leads to more sin. It's exactly what happens for David. Listen to how he deals with it and hear ourselves. This is in verse 6. So David sent word to Joab, send me Uriah the Hittite. And Joab sent Uriah to David. And when Uriah came to David, David asked how Joab and the other people fared and how the war was going. Isn't that sweet of David? Wasn't that kind of him to check in on everybody? Hey, Uriah, how is everyone? How's the battle down in Rabbah going? Are you doing okay, buddy? I love you. I'm just so glad to see you. Isn't David such a good guy? No, he's not a good guy in this circumstance. Then David said to Uriah, go down to your house and wash your feet, a euphemism probably for sex. In other words, go home, have sex with your wife so that nobody will know that this is my kid. David's plan is cover up, right? His plan initially, when confronted by his own sin and adultery, his initial plan, cover it up. Do whatever I can, make sure nobody finds out, let's cover it up. It's a cunning plan too. This is about as good a plan as you could come up with to cover up this particular sin. David's not an idiot, but he is broken. Uriah went out of the king's house, and there followed him a present from the king. He's really landed on thick. But Uriah slept at the entrance of the king's house with all the servants of his lord, and did not go down to his house. When they told David, Uriah did not go down to his house. David said, Uriah, you just came over on a journey. Why didn't you go down to your house? And Uriah said, the ark and Israel and Judah remain in booths, and my lord Joab and the servants of my lord are camping in the open field. Shall I then go to my house to eat and drink and to lie with my wife? As you live and as your soul lives, I will not do such a thing. You have to love this. Uriah the Hittite. Uriah the Hittite is not Jewish, right? He's a Hittite, which means he's not one of Abraham's descendants. Uriah the Hittite, a Gentile, is demonstrating more integrity and honor than King David, the greatest king in Israel's history. You see the contrast that's being set up here. David inviting Uriah to go home and sleep with his wife to cover up his own sin. Uriah saying, look, all of Israel, right? All of Israel is out fighting. My colleagues, my comrades are out fighting. It says the ark in Israel and Judah remain in booths, remain in tents. In other words, everybody's out there. I'm not going to give myself comfort while all of my people are out in the elements. I came home because you called me. I'm going to do whatever it is that you need me to do, and then I'm going to go back out to the battle. Uriah the Hittite is absolutely upright, and he's following the commandments, actually. Right? The Jewish law stipulated that in battle, you're not going to come home and sleep with your wife. You wait until it's over. So then David says in verse 12, David said to Uriah, remain here today, and tomorrow I'll send you back. So David realizes that his plan has been foiled. So Uriah remained in Jerusalem that day, and on the next day, David invited him to eat and drink in his presence and made him drunk. So David's next plan, all right, Uriah, you're such an upright guy. Let's see what happens when you get drunk. David's not an idiot. He knows what happens when folk get drunk. They make bad decisions. That's what he's counting on. And in the evening, he went out to lie on his couch with the servants of his Lord, but he did not go down to his house. Do you hear that a drunk Gentile Uriah is more faithful, has more integrity, and greater honor than King David, a man after God's own heart? That's how far David has fallen. Remember the heights, the peaks that we have just achieved, right? God has offered eternal covenant to David. I'll never remove my steadfast love from you. David lives that covenant out in the way that he treats Mephibosheth. And now David is resorting to getting guys drunk in the hopes that they will cover up his own sin. Unfortunately, he's not done. In the morning, David wrote a letter to Joab and sent it by the hand of Uriah. In the letter, he wrote, set Uriah in the forefront of the hardest fighting and then draw back from him so that he may be struck down and die. David's plan. Catch it, right? He sends the order for Uriah's murder by Uriah's own hand to Joab, Uriah's commander. And he orders Uriah's murder. Now we're not talking about just covering up, just hoping that Uriah will have sex with his wife so that nobody will know that David has committed adultery and fathered this kid. Now we're just flat out murdering Uriah. How far has David fallen? The same guy who's a man after God's own heart. That's who murders Uriah the Hittite. And by the way, think about now how many people are drawn into the story of David's sin. What begins with David's eyes, his wandering eyes, then draws in Bathsheba, which then draws in Uriah, which then draws in Joab, the general, who gets the order from King David. And that draws in the men around Uriah who push the forefront of the battle forward and then pull back and watch Uriah die. Think about how many people have been pulled into the orbit of David's sin. Sin has this kind of centrifugal force, right? It pulls others into its orbit. It's one of the reflections that I think we have to make on our own sin. Don't we fool ourselves all the time by saying, well, I'm the only one involved in this. Not too many people, nobody's going to get hurt, or not too many people are going to get hurt. They'll never notice. But sin has a way of pulling more into its orbit. And that's exactly the story that unfolds for David. He pulls his entire army into the orbit of his own sin. All right, where are we? What verse are we on? 17. Did I read that yet? Back on 16. As Joab was besieging the city, he assigned Uriah to the place where he knew that the valiant warriors were. The men of the city came out and fought with Joab and some of the servants of David among the people. fell. Uriah the Hittite was killed as well. Then Joab sent and told David all the news concerning the fighting, and he instructed the messenger. He gives the messenger particular instructions. So the messenger went, this is down in verse 22. So the messenger went and came and told David all that Joab had sent him to tell. The messenger said to David, the men gained an advantage over us and came out against us in the field, but we drove them back to the entrance of the gate. And then the archers shot at your servants from the wall. Some of the king's servants are dead, and your servant Uriah the Hittite is dead also. And David said to the messenger, thus you shall say to Joab, don't let this matter trouble you, for the sword devours now one and now the other. Press your attack for the city and overthrow it, and encourage him. David's plan has been enacted, and his response to his general Joab is, stuff happens. Good night. It is so hard to believe that this is David. Nothing prepares us for this in David's story. And now we hear this just utterly callous and cold-hearted response to Uriah the Hittite, who's later listed as one of David's fighting men, if you're familiar with that. Uriah is one of David's closest warriors. And in response to his death, David says, things happen. When the wife of Uriah heard that her husband was dead, she made lamentation for him. And when her mourning was over, David sent and brought her to his house, and she became his wife and bore him a son. That's how you do it. But one last phrase in this chapter. But the thing that David had done displeased the Lord. That is not a sentence that I ever want uttered about me. But the thing that David had done displeased the Lord. Chapter 12 tells the story of David being confronted with his sin by the prophet Nathan. It tells about God's response, which is there are consequences to sin. There are consequences to sin that will extend deep into the future of your family. You've brought the sword into your family, and now the sword will devour your family. But David confesses, repents, and God says, I will not remove my love from you. There are consequences, but I will not remove my love from you. A couple things that I take away from 11. Like I said, we're going to focus more on 12 on Sunday morning. It's a little bit easier story to tell in mixed company, but it also gets to the heart of the outcome. But I think it's worth reflecting on 11 for a little while. I think this notion that rejecting our own identity leads us down a path that goes away from God is worth considering. That when instead, so often we're afraid to be who God made us to be, but what we find is when we lean into that, we lead ourselves, or we're led down a more righteous path, a path that's more consistent with who God wants us to be. That's one point of reflection. Second point of reflection is what I was talking about just a second ago. The centrifugal force of sin is potent. Do not fool yourself. We cannot fool ourselves into thinking that our sin will only affect me, or me and one other, or me and a couple others. It just has a way, I'm telling you, for the last, I don't know how long have humans existed. Sin pulls people into its orbit. Pull yourself into thinking this will just affect you. The third point of reflection for me in this chapter, sin has a way of warping our view of right and wrong. Right? It turns up into down and down into up. David, a man after God's own heart, doesn't just try to cover it up a little bit. He resorts to murder. It turns right into wrong and wrong into right. And last but not least, and here's the word of hope for me in this chapter. What we hear in David is our own story. While we hear so much good about who David is before this chapter, it reminds us that David is absolutely one of us. Right? He walked the same dirt that you and I walk today. And he fell in the same ways that you and I fall today. And yet, God still chooses him. And yet, what we hear in chapter 12 in particular, there are consequences. But one of those consequences is not that David is unloved. One of those consequences is not that God abandons David in his sin. What we hear in this chapter in brutal form is David's humanity. And in David's humanity, we see our own humanity. And in the grace and hesed that God extends to David, we hear the grace and hesed that God extends to us. So in the midst of the darkest chapter of David's life, there is a word of hope embedded, I think, for us. That word of hope is, yeah, there's consequences. But one of those consequences will never be that our sin overwhelms God's capacity for love. So don't lose sight of it. It's good for us to reflect on our own brokenness, but always in the container of knowing that we are loved. We always reflect on our own brokenness in the container of knowing that forgiveness is available to us through the work of Jesus Christ on the cross. So before we break into groups, good Lord, that was heavy. Whew. Before we break into groups, any questions for clarification? Anything that we need to spend a little bit more time on here in 11 that will help you understand the story a little bit better?
Did we ever find out if after this all happened, if Bathsheba was kind of on board with the transition from being Uriah's wife to?
I love the way that's stated. So Brian Mutterman's question: do we find out if Bathsheba ever gets on board with the transition from being Uriah's husband to David's husband? The answer is yes. Bathsheba does get on board with that transition. The child that David and Bathsheba conceive in adultery dies. That's a difficult part of chapter 12. This is part of the consequence of sin, is the death of this child. That's a theological conversation that's worth having. Gosh, we're short on time. So if that's one that you want to have, that's a deeply troubling passage. I don't want to skirt it. If you want to talk about that, you let me know. I'll meet you for coffee anytime, any place. So after that child dies, David and Bathsheba conceive another child. I'm imagining somebody knows who that child is. Solomon. David and Bathsheba conceive Solomon together. Bathsheba then works with David to ensure that Solomon is crowned the next king, and who eventually becomes the wealthiest and most powerful king in Israel's history. So yeah, she gets on board. Good question.
More of a, you don't remember, I don't remember reading it, but is she ever, I understand she gets on board, and obviously her son now is Solomon. Is she ever happy about this? I don't think, she obviously said no to the king he called for, but.
I don't know the answer to that, Brian. The question is whether Bathsheba ever is more than a hostage. I think we can say yes. Well, yeah. I mean, yes, but the question would be why, Pat. Pat's saying, isn't she favored of the family? Yes, she becomes favored. Obviously, her son is the one who becomes king, even though David has an older son. So the question would be, why was Bathsheba the favored one? Maybe David's feeling guilty. Perhaps she's the hottest. I don't know. I don't know that necessarily speaks to whether Bathsheba ever loves David as a wife and a husband. Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, a little bit into by this culture too, because is Michael still in the picture, but it's common to have more than one spouse. It just the way it was, and they were more property than an actual relation.
Yes, Michael Culver's bringing up polygamy in Scripture. That feels like the right time to move on. So, yes, David is married to other women, has multiple wives. Solomon really brings that to new heights, though. In David's defense, Solomon is way better at having a lot more wives. This is the biblical marriage that they talk about. That it changes in the New Testament. Still wagon. It changes. All right. Any other questions or clarification before we break into groups? Hey, I want to encourage you with the questions this morning. They're uncomfortable. The whole thing is uncomfortable. Lean into it. Be okay with some discomfort, and maybe have the courage to go one step further than you would typically be willing to share as we engage in this conversation. I'm not asking for open confessions of your deepest, darkest secrets, but open reflections on the impact of sin and grace in your life. I think could be a powerful moment for us this morning. So let's break into groups. I just want you to know.